You can make a pretty strong argument that waterbending is the most powerful form of bending in Avatar, and it's pretty easy to do actually. It really does have the most versatility as far as the general abilities, manipulating the phases of water, and more specialized techniques to even manipulate living things. But how far can you actually take waterbending, and what are the limits? What can be pushed towards and what can be broken? That's pretty much what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing to talk about is just going over some of the basic abilities of waterbending, which should be pretty straightforward. Waterbending tends to have a lot of versatility. It can be used both offensively, defensively, but also has some utility outside of combat, like healing. Of course, you can manipulate the flow of water and kind of control it, which is pretty much how you first learn how to bend. Waterbenders can change the phase of water to change to things like ice or snow, fog and steam. That's a pretty common case. From these, it seems like ice is the most common type of phase change and can be applied to a variety of different settings, both offensively and defensively. We can see different weapons made out of ice, like spears or knives and even types of blades, but it can also be used to create walls, types of shields, and even larger domes to contain other things. Lots of different projectiles can also be created with ice and launched towards different opponents. Another pretty common ability is being able to propel yourself underwater at a very fast rate. Waterbenders can also sort of envelop their own limbs to mimic something like a tentacle, which can be used defensively, but also to extend and strike opponents or even lift them off the ground completely, which we've seen a few times. One of the last things that's a basic ability is just manipulating the environment around them, so they can do things like crossing a large body of water. They can do this by walking on top of it with ice, or even walking on the ground and bending the water above them, which we've seen. Just from talking about the basic abilities alone, we can see that waterbending can extend pretty far and just has a lot of application to a variety of different settings. The first type of limitation that we're going to talk about that waterbending breaks is the fact that waterbenders can bend more than just 100% water. Essentially, any type of liquid that partially contains water seems to be able to be bent by waterbenders from all different skill levels. A good example of this is when Katara and Toph ended up fighting in the mud. Both of them were able to sort of fight each other and bend the mud to their will, as it contained both water and earth. Katara had no struggles with this and seemed to do so comfortably. Later on, in another example of this, we see Katara and Toph work together by helping clean up the polluted river in the episode about the Painted Lady Spirit. This seems to have massive implications for the world of Avatar, since the major issue of pollution seems to have a pretty reliable way to solve, just needing some earthbenders and waterbenders being able to work that out and filter that out. And arguably the largest example of this is when Katara and Toph were able to bend the massive amounts of slurry, which is that mix of water and earth, back inside of the massive drill at Ba Sing Se to help destroy that machine. Moving on to a new type of liquid that's able to be bent, Katara was able to waterbend perfume when they were trying to confuse the Shirshu after Team Avatar was being tracked by them. There were these large tubs of perfume that got dumped on the ground, and Katara was able to bend this and pretty much disperse it all into the air so that would confuse Nyla the Shirshu and overwhelm its enhanced sense of smell. This was a pretty cool application of waterbending and just shows another example of how it can extend to essentially any type of liquid. There's also a variety of these types of smaller examples that might just pass by if you're not really paying attention to it. In the Kyoshi novels, the waterbender Karima, which was the main bender that first taught Kyoshi waterbending, she quickly bent some wine and froze it on the ground to make a policeman slip. Other times we've seen this is when waterbenders can bend soup into different bowls and distribute it, across many different people. There's been other times where we've seen ink being spilt out over tables to cause some type of distraction. There's even a character called Maulo, and he's referred to as the paint bender. He uses his waterbending abilities to do performances for crowds and make different pieces of artwork live, which is pretty cool. And this was introduced in the Avatar role-playing game. Lastly, Avatar Aang jokes about using glue bending to defeat Fire Lord Ozai, which is pretty funny when you think about it, but we've never actually seen it, and again, it's not confirmed, but it's another example of how waterbending can extend really far beyond just water, and maybe in ways we don't even know of yet. Moving on to the next limitation that waterbending breaks is the ability to manipulate living things. We've seen advanced waterbenders both in The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra be able to directly manipulate people, animals, and plants. Probably the most iconic example of this is bloodbending. This is a pretty advanced technique where only very powerful waterbenders can do this, but essentially advanced waterbenders can directly bend the blood inside people's bodies and control their movements. This is best showcased in the episode The Puppet Master with the innkeeper Hama. She was the inventor of bloodbending and explains that she practiced this technique on rats while she was imprisoned by the Fire Nation when she was younger. Although this is really scary, it can only be done by very powerful benders under the power of the full moon at night. Of course, there are some people with enhanced abilities like the Yukon family from Legend of Korra, who they can demonstrate this ability, bloodbending during the day, but it's so extremely rare, and in the modern day Republic City, bloodbending is strictly prohibited. Another way that waterbenders can manipulate living things is by plant bending. We've seen this used in kind of two distinct styles. So the first one is by fully extracting the water from plants and getting that source of water and using it pretty much however the user chooses. So this was seen a lot when Kintara was fighting with Hama, and they kept replenishing their water while they were fighting each other in the forest. Of course, this destroyed a lot of the plant life in the area, which is kind of the main downside when it comes to this type of plant bending. During this fight, we even see Hama and Katara drain all the water out of fully grown trees with relative ease. Of course, with this in mind, you can imagine that a powerful waterbender can fully eliminate trees and forests during a full moon, like some big form of deforestation. Of course, we've never actually seen this occur, but it is plausible given what we've seen in the shows, and it would be just a massive form of destruction to the environment. Another method in which plant bending can occur is by actually controlling living plants by bending the water that's inside them. This was best seen when Team Avatar met the Foggy Swamp tribes around the Earth Kingdom in the episode The Swamp. They were able to move around large vines pretty easily, and even create this giant swamp-like monster by bending probably hundreds of vines all together and forming different movements and coordinating all that water bending together. So with this being said, waterbenders should really have no type of problems manipulating all sorts of plant life that rely on water, and it's just another source that waterbenders can kind of pull from when it comes to the real world, and just have that utility when other water sources aren't available there. Something else we've seen from waterbenders is being able to change or remove the fluids within someone's body. We've seen people being able to bend the water out of their lungs whenever they've been close to drowning. Of course, Katara has done this multiple times. This is a good example of why precision is very important when performing this type of bending. Whenever you're doing something like this, the waterbender really has to focus in on the water that's inside of their lungs and extract that up through their throat and out through the mouth. They really want to focus in on that and not be able to bend the other parts of water inside their bodies in order to not harm the person. Waterbenders can also change the actual temperature of the water inside people's bodies. Probably the best example of this was from the Avatar Kyoshi novels, so quick spoilers regarding those two books here. At the end of the second book, a final fight happens between Yun and Kyoshi and her friends. Yun approaches Kyoshi as it seems like the battle is over and he's defeated most of her friends and they're kind of incapacitated. But Kyoshi was able to get close to him and sort of put her hand on his chest as they were talking. When she did this, she rapidly lowered the temperature of his heart and lungs, way to the point where they were eventually frozen solid, which eventually ended up killing him, right there on the spot. It's not exactly clear how difficult this is. We do know that Kyoshi was not in the Avatar state, So it seems like a relatively skilled bender would be able to perform this, but of course, just simply practicing this can cause some major damage. You can also imagine that waterbenders would have the ability to bend sort of the natural oils and water on the skin of a person, which doing this would probably leave them all shriveled up, and this would pretty much severely weaken them, if not kill them. With all the different ways that waterbenders can manipulate living things, it really showcases how deadly a skilled waterbender can be if they have these kind of malicious intentions. Now, the next limitation that waterbending breaks past is the ability to interact with spirits. So it's pretty well established that waterbenders have the ability to heal other people, and that's been showcased a lot throughout both series. So we can see that one specialized technique of healing is being able to calm down spirits back to just their regular form whenever there's any kind of negative energy or dark spirit form for them. We see this a lot during the events of The Legend of Korra Season 2. So basically, whenever they're trying to calm the spirits down, they completely surround the dark spirit in these rings of water. They activate the healing, which glows all gold. And then whenever they're completed with that, it changes their appearance and they go to their kind of dark spirit form back to their regular form, so turning that negative energy back into positive energy. We see this being able to be used both on a single spirit, but also groups of spirits simultaneously. So this is yet another extension of waterbending, which is almost like a specialized technique over this already established form of utility of healing. So not only is waterbending able to manipulate living beings, it can change this aura and overall appearance when it comes to these spirits, and that really can change their level of threat to the user. So this is yet another way that waterbenders can help defend themselves in certain situations whenever they might encounter these dark spirits. Moving on to the final limitation that waterbending breaks is the ability to manipulate the weather and the overall environment around them. So we've already kind of talked about things like plant bending and bending more liquids than just water, but this is really going to focus on larger scale things like the weather. So we've seen that waterbenders have the ability to change clouds around into different shapes or different locations. So of course we see this with Aang and Katara. That's pretty much the main showcases of this ability. So the main use case when it comes to an episode was helping resolve the conflict in The Last Airbender with the fortune teller lady and how they were trying to foretell the volcano that was close to erupting there. So this is definitely a possibility that waterbenders can manipulate clouds, but it seems unlikely that these typical waterbenders would be able to perform this because you have to be pretty close to the cloud in order to actually manipulate it. So we haven't really seen this done by people actually on the ground trying to bend these clouds hundreds of feet in the air. We've never really seen anything of that scale. The next technique here is waterbenders being able to create whirlpools in large bodies of water. The most notable example of this is when Aang and Katara were able to defeat the giant serpent in the episode The Serpent's Pass. As they were fighting it, they were eventually able to circle the serpent so quickly on the surface of the water, it created this massive whirlpool, which eventually slammed the serpent into the side of that narrow mountain structure there. We can really see how much force this generated because the serpent was just so massive and it really slammed hard up against that structure there, and it eventually just left them alone, probably just from being hurt so badly. So both Aang and Katara were pretty skilled by this point in the show, but it seems like it's not something that requires too much skill or is that complicated, especially if you have a good amount of waterbenders, more than just two, and it just seems like it has the potential to be replicated somewhat easily. Now when it comes to bending massive amounts of water to form something like a big tidal wave or tsunami, this is actually possible, but the main thing is that it requires an avatar level of power here. So in The Last Airbender, when we learn about Avatar Kuruk, we actually see a scene where he uses the avatar state to create this massive tidal wave, which pretty much looks like a tsunami here. Of course, we don't really know the context of this, it's just a very, very short clip of when we see this occur. So this is another thing that waterbending does have the capacity to do, although as of right now, it's solely just the avatar that's able to perform this feat here. So again, having the ability just in general to create a literal natural disaster is really quite scary whenever these people go into the avatar state like that. This reinforces the point of how waterbending really is the strongest form of bending and is pretty much the strongest element by a pretty big margin, if you ask me. One limitation of this sort of technique we can see is that we've never seen an avatar actually deliberately create something like a hurricane. So we've definitely seen larger tornadoes created by Aang or other groups of airbenders, but nothing exactly like a hurricane from what I can remember. And this is something that probably requires a combination of airbending and waterbending, so it's probably another avatar-only type of technique to create a hurricane-like phenomenon. I don't believe solely a waterbender would be able to do something like this. It probably has to be the avatar. And probably the last thing when it comes to manipulating the environment is that we've seen waterbenders pull the water vapor right out of thin air to create a source of water for themselves. This kind of seems like another advanced technique, but might not have the most application. So there's not a lot of water that can be really extracted from the air. It's just kind of meant for like emergency situations and not really for larger scale use. Either way, kind of pulling your element right out of thin air is pretty cool and sure to be useful in some senses. This is another unique technique that we first got introduced to by Hama in the Puppet Master episode. So if we're taking everything into consideration of what we've talked about with the specialized techniques, manipulating living things and spirits, and even the weather and the environment, let's go over just some overall actual limitations that waterbending has. So the first one is that there are certain circumstances that have to be present for some of these advanced techniques to happen. The most notable example of this is bloodbending. People who have the ability to bloodbend can really only do it during the influence of the full moon. And you can even reason that some of these more advanced techniques might not require the full moon, but it's just that it's so much easier and doesn't have as much requirement of strength or stamina in order to perform these type of feats. This would be something like extracting all the water from fully grown trees. This seems to be pretty easy for Katara during the influence of a full moon, but it might just prove a bit more difficult and strenuous on a normal day or night. But honestly, it's really not that big of a limitation because a large majority of the techniques available to waterbenders, they can do, day or night. They don't really have to rely on these super specific techniques in order to be an effective waterbender and still have these offensive and defensive capabilities. The next limitation, which I would argue is the most prominent for all waterbenders, is that the user has to be relatively close to water in order to effectively bend it. So they really have to take the proximity into account when they're in the real world and using their waterbending. This is kind of what I was referring to back when we were discussing cloud bending. It's pretty much, people can't just bend clouds on the ground when they're, hundreds or thousands of feet above them. We've never really seen that. The bending has to be pretty much in their immediate vicinity in order for them to effectively bend it. When it comes to avatars and their ability to waterbend, they can kind of push past this limitation a little bit by going into the avatar state. So this can kind of extend their grasp of water to pull it from larger distances, but it's not going to be, hundreds of miles away here. So kind of like an example of this was in the series finale of Avatar when Aang was in the avatar state and he pulled a ton of that water from the ocean, which was a good distance away from him. So that's kind of, pushing past that limitation there. But still, you can't just totally grasp all the water in your area for miles and miles and miles. We haven't really seen that, so it really seems like the proximity tends to be the number one limitation when it comes to waterbending. Following up from that, pretty much the last limitation that waterbending has is that some techniques only the avatar is able to perform. Now, this is kind of a weird one where you can mention this limitation for all forms of bending. Of course, the Avatar has so much power and knowledge from their past lives is that they can push elements really to their limit and even past that. So, they can break the limits of air bending, earth bending, fire bending. And, I really don't think this is a limitation solely just to water bending. It's just that for certain things like creating a tidal wave or a tsunami, things like this, of course, that's really going to be only accessible to the Avatar. But again, I really don't think this is a water bending only limitation. I think this is going to be applied to all elements where only the Avatar is going to be able to perform a very specific set of bending techniques. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the overall limitations of waterbending in Avatar. So you can see that there's really not a lot of hard limitations and that you can push waterbending pretty far, maybe farther than you might previously thought. So, they have so much offensive and defensive capabilities. They have a lot of different utility tools. So I really think it's just so strong and has a lot of versatility here. So that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you leave a comment to let me know what you think, and I hope you have a great day.